The noise hit me first, a physical wall of clinking crystal and performative laughter that felt denser than the core of a dying star. I stood near the limestone pillar, my back rigid against the cool stone, calculating the precise trajectory to the nearest exit. 32 feet, weaving through a minefield of donors who claimed to love astronomy but only understood the tax write-offs. I checked my watch. 8:04 p.m. I had been the guest of honor for exactly 4 minutes. It felt like a geologic epoch. I was about to calculate the velocity needed to escape the event horizon of this gala when I felt it. The distinct, prickling weight of a gaze that wasn't admiring the science. It was dissecting the scientist. The gallery was designed to be impressive, a cavern of brutalist concrete and strategically placed spotlights that cost more than my entire research grant. To everyone else, it was a triumph of modern architecture, a temple of light and shadow. To me, it was just a vacuum chamber with better catering. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, ozone, and the metallic tang of ambition. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the silk lining of my suit jacket slide against my skin. It was my armor, this suit. Sharp, charcoal, tailored to within a millimeter of my life. It told the room that Dr. Eris Thorne was composed, successful, and entirely self-sufficient. It lied beautifully. Inside the structure, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a pulsar spinning out of control. I took a sip of the champagne I didn't want, the bubbles sharp and aggressive against my tongue. I hated champagne. It tasted like static. But the flute was a prop, a shield I could hold between myself and the encroaching bodies. A man in a velvet blazer drifted too close, his cologne a cloud of musk. I didn't make eye contact. Instead, I focused on the mental catalog I used to drown out the noise. Alpha Centauri A, G2V. Distance, 4.37 light-years. Surface temperature, 5,790 Kelvin. The numbers were clean. They were safe. They didn't ask me why I hadn't brought a +1, or why my hands were always cold. I moved deeper into the shadow of a hanging sculpture, a twisted mass of steel meant to represent orbital decay. It was ironic. I was the expert on decay, on things falling apart slowly over billions of years. Yet I couldn't manage a 2-hour cocktail party without feeling like I was disintegrating. People circled me, drawn by the gravity of my reputation. The cover of Nature, the grant awards, the breakthrough on dark energy. But they never actually touched. They hovered at a safe distance, tossing compliments across the gap like radio signals sent into deep space. Brilliant work, Doctor. Fascinating lecture. I nodded, smiling the thin, practiced smile I had perfected in front of a mirror. I was a celestial object to them, something to be observed and admired, but never approached. My eyes burned with the phantom pressure of pressing my orbital bone against a telescope eyepiece for 12 hours straight. My vision was tuned for the dark, for detecting the faintest smudges of light from galaxies that had died before the Earth was born. In this room, with its harsh halogen spotlights, I felt overexposed, raw. My fingers were stiff around the stem of the glass, the cold crystal biting into skin that was already freezing, a side effect of spending my life in domes kept at near-zero temperatures to protect the mirrors. I had acclimated to the cold so thoroughly that warmth now felt suspicious. I needed to leave. The thought wasn't a panic response anymore. It was a logical conclusion. The data was clear. Social battery, depleted. Oxygen levels, insufficient. I was preparing to set the glass down on a passing tray, to make my escape into the cool, indifferent night, when the crowd suddenly shifted. It wasn't a chaotic movement. It was a smooth, fluid parting, like water moving around a stone. And there she was. She wasn't mingling. She wasn't holding a drink. She was standing in the shadow of a massive marble archway, perfectly still, watching me. The noise of the room seemed to drop away, dampened by the sudden, intense focus of her gaze. She wasn't looking at the great astronomer. She wasn't looking at the suit or the accolades. She was looking right at the tension in my jaw, the way my thumb dug into the glass, the desperate calculation in my eyes. Her gaze was unblinking, patient, and terrifyingly precise. She didn't drift through the crowd like the donors in their chiffon and velvet. She carved through it. Serafina Vane. I knew the name, of course. The curator who had turned this gallery from a tax haven into a cultural, jagged edge. She was wearing something structural, a dark architectural draping that looked less like a dress and more like it had been folded from shadow using origami precision. As she closed the distance, the ambient noise of the gala seemed to dampen, absorbed by the sheer density of her presence. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to breach the standard social perimeter, far enough to force me to lean in if I wanted to be heard. She didn't smile. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely devoid of the deference I was used to. She wasn't here to ask about dark matter. She was here to investigate the void standing in front of her. "You're vibrating," she said. Her voice was low, a rich contralto that seemed to resonate in the floorboards beneath my heels. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the clinical detachment of a peer reviewer finding a flaw in the methodology. I blinked, my mental catalog of stellar classifications stuttering to a halt. The sudden directness was disorienting. "Excuse me?" I managed, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. "Your frequency," she clarified, her gaze dropping to my hand, then back to my eyes. "You're vibrating at a frequency that suggests you're about to shatter. It's distracting from the sculpture." She gestured vaguely to the twisted steel behind me. "You're making the art look stable by comparison." I stiffened, the armor of my suit suddenly feeling very thin. "I assure you, I'm perfectly fine. I'm just observing." "You're perfectly terrified," she corrected. She stepped closer, invading the vacuum I had so carefully constructed. The scent of her hit me then. Old paper, rain, and something sharp like ozone. It was the smell of a library window left open during a thunderstorm. Without asking, she reached out. Her hand was warm, her fingers long and unadorned save for a single, heavy silver band. She wrapped her hand around the bowl of my champagne flute, right over my fingers. The heat of her skin against my freezing knuckles was a shock, a thermal bloom that registered instantly on every nerve ending. It was a violation of the sterile field I kept around myself, yet I didn't pull away. "Let go," she commanded softly, and God help me, I did. She took the glass, the one I had been clutching like a life raft for 20 minutes, and set it on a nearby pedestal with a dismissive clink. I felt untethered, my hands suddenly empty and useless at my sides. But she didn't leave me hanging in the void. She reached into the pocket of her structure jacket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She pressed it into my palm, curling my cold fingers around it with a deliberate, molding pressure. It wasn't a drink. It was a stone. Rough, heavy, iron cold. "Meteorite," she murmured, her face inches from mine. "Campo del cielo. Iron and nickel. It survived atmospheric entry at 26,000 miles per hour. It knows how to take the heat. Hold on to it. It's heavier than the air you're trying to breathe." Then came the water. She signaled a waiter with a subtle tilt of her head. Power, absolute and quiet, and handed me a heavy tumbler of sparkling water. "Drink. The champagne is just acid and pretension. This will actually hydrate you." I took the glass, my other hand still gripping the meteorite. The weight of the stone was grounding, a physical anchor point in a spinning room. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was pulled back severe and tight, revealing the sharp line of a jaw that didn't know how to compromise. "Why?" I asked. The word felt dangerous. Serafina leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the ambient chatter like a laser through darkness. "Because I've been watching you for an hour, Dr. Thorne. You've calculated the exit vectors, you've analyzed the lighting, you've categorized every person in this room as a celestial body you don't want to orbit." She paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy and charged. "I know what you're avoiding. You look at the sky so you never have to look anyone in the eye. You focus on light years to avoid the millimeters." The accusation hung in the air between us, heavier than gravity. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. And the terrifying part wasn't that she had said it. The terrifying part was that she was right. I opened my mouth to argue. My reflex was immediate, a defensive flare shielding the core. I wanted to explain that distance is a necessity, not a flaw. I wanted to lecture her on the observer effect, on how the very act of getting close to a subject changes it, distorts the data. I wanted to tell her that if you stand too close to a star, you don't see the light, you just get incinerated. "It's called objective distance," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "It's how you ensure the data remains uncorrupted. If I don't look people in the eye, it's because I'm looking at the bigger picture." Serafina didn't even blink. She tilted her head, a small, terrifyingly knowing smile playing on her lips. "That's a beautiful lecture, Doctor. Truly, you can put it in your next grant proposal. But right now, you're gripping that meteorite like it's the only thing keeping you attached to the floor. Your objective distance looks a lot like panic from where I'm standing." She stepped back, breaking the intense proximity, but leaving the charge in the air, a static field that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You're done performing," she stated. It wasn't a question. "The donors have seen the suit. The board has seen the face. You've fulfilled the contract. Now, you can stay here and suffocate in the vacuum, or you can come with me." "Go where?" I asked. The question felt childish, stripped of my usual authority. "Out," she said, "away from the noise." She turned and began to walk toward the exit. She didn't check to see if I was following. She moved with a gravitational pull that was impossible to ignore. I looked at the crowd, at the sea of meaningless conversations and forced laughter, and then I looked at her retreating back, the sharp line of her spine straight and uncompromising. The calculation took less than a nanosecond. I set the water glass down, tightened my grip on the cold iron of the meteorite, and followed her. The transition was violent. We pushed through the heavy glass doors, and the climate-controlled stillness of the gallery shattered. The city night hit me like a physical blow, cold, raw, and smelling of wet concrete and exhaust. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was real. I took a breath, a real breath, the cold air filling my lungs and scrubbing away the scent of stale perfume. Serafina didn't head for the line of idling black town cars. She turned left, walking straight into the wind. "My car is..." I started, gesturing vaguely toward the valet stand. "We're walking," she cut in, not breaking stride. "You need to feel the ground. You've been floating in a zero-G tank for 2 hours. If you get in a car now, you'll just be transferring from one box to another." I hesitated, looking at my Italian leather heels, then at the uneven pavement. Then, surprisingly, I started walking. I caught up to her, falling into step beside her. The rhythm of our movement was different. In the gallery, I had been static, an object. Here, I was kinetic. My heels clicked a sharp staccato rhythm against the stone, a frantic counterpoint to the soft, heavy thud of her boots. We walked in silence for blocks. The city moved around us, a blur of yellow taxis, the distant wail of a siren, the low hum of the grid. Usually, I filtered this out. I looked up, finding the few stars strong enough to punch through the light pollution. But Serafina wouldn't let me look up. She kept drawing my attention back to the horizon, to the immediate. "Watch the puddle," she warned, her voice low. Her hand came out of her pocket, hovering near my elbow, but not touching. The heat of her palm radiated through the cold air, a ghost touch that I felt more acutely than the wind. We navigated the streets like binary stars, orbiting a common center of gravity, but never quite colliding. The air between us was thick, charged with the unsaid. Every time her shoulder brushed against my arm, a collision of wool and silk, a jolt went straight to my spine. It was maddening. It was exhilarating. I was the expert on forces that hold the universe together, yet I had no equation for the pull she exerted just by walking next to me. "You're still calculating," she said, breaking the silence as we turned down a narrower, quieter street. The buildings here were older, brick and iron looming over us. "I'm always calculating," I admitted. "It's not a switch I can turn off." "Then change the variable," she said. She stopped in front of a nondescript steel door set into the side of a renovated warehouse. She pulled a keycard from her pocket. "Stop calculating the distance to the exit. Start calculating the friction." She swiped the card. The light turned green. She held the door open, her body blocking the wind, creating a pocket of stillness for me to step into. I looked at the dark interior, then at her. The meteorite was warm in my hand now, absorbing my heat. I realized with a start that I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what I might find in it. "After you, Doctor," she whispered. And for the first time in my life, I stepped into the unknown without a map. The freight elevator groaned upward, a rattling cage of industrial mesh and scarred steel that smelled of grease and old dust. It was the antithesis of the silent, frictionless elevators in the gallery, and I found the mechanical struggle of it strangely comforting. It was a machine doing work, not a magic trick. When the gate finally clattered open on the roof, the wind hit us with the force of a physical reprimand. We stepped out onto the gravel surface. It was a private garden of sorts, wild and neglected, with hardy ornamental grasses hissing in the wind, and concrete planters cracking under the pressure of roots. But the view was the point. We were high enough that the city grid laid itself out below us like a circuit board, humming with electricity. My reflex was instantaneous. I tilted my head back, seeking the familiar anchor of the zenith. Even through the haze of the city's light pollution, I could pick out the belt of Orion, the faint smudge of the Pleiades. They were dim, washed out by the sodium vapor glow of the streets, but they were there. Constant. Silent. Safe. "Stop it," Serafina said. She wasn't looking at the sky. She was leaning against the waist-high concrete parapet, her back to the drop, watching me. "You're doing it again. You're looking for the exit." "I'm looking for the baseline," I corrected, stepping toward the edge but keeping a respectful distance from the vertigo. "The stars are the only thing that doesn't change. Down there," I gestured to the sprawling, breathing city below. "That's just chaos. Entropy in real time." "It's not entropy," she countered, pushing off the wall and moving toward me. "It's friction. It's heat. Look at it, Eris." She used my first name. It sounded different in the open air, stripped of the academic title, stripped of the armor. It sounded like a summons. I forced my gaze down. The city was a mess of amber and white light, traffic moving in arteries of red and gold. It was loud, even from this height, a low-frequency thrum of tires on pavement, distant sirens, the collective exhale of 3 million people. "Parallax," I murmured, the concept surfacing unbidden. The apparent displacement of an object because of a change in the observer's point of view. "Exactly," Serafina said, stepping into my personal space until the wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. "You've been looking at the world from a telescope for so long, you've forgotten what it looks like from the ground. You see data points. I see the mess. The mess is inefficient, I argued, though my voice lacked its usual bite. The wind was pushing us together, a chaotic variable I hadn't accounted for. The mess is where the life is, she said. She turned, leaning her elbows on the parapet next to me, forcing our arms to brush. The contact was electric, a sudden grounding current that made the vertigo vanish, replaced by a different kind of dizziness. Tell me, doctor, what are you so afraid of finding if you stop looking up? Do you think the ground is going to dissolve? I gripped the cold concrete of the wall, my knuckles white. The meteorite was still in my pocket, a heavy lump against my hip. I'm afraid of the noise, I admitted, the truth tearing itself out of me before I could check the calculations. The stars are quiet. People are loud. They want things. They need things. They collide. Collisions create energy, Serafina whispered. She turned her head, her face inches from mine. The scent of her, that mix of old books, rain, and sharp ozone, was overwhelming now, drowning out the exhaust of the city. It was a scent that demanded attention. It was a scent that made me want to lean in, to close the gap, to test the friction she kept talking about. Her eyes were dark, reflecting the city lights like twin events horizons. You can't orbit forever, Eris. Eventually, gravity wins. Eventually, you have to land. I looked at her, really looked at her, not as a variable to be solved, but as a force to be reckoned with. The wind howled around us, but in the space between our bodies, the air was still and heavy. I wanted to show her that my silence wasn't empty, that the dark wasn't just a lack of light, it was a canvas. I can't land here, I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. It's too bright. I can't show you who I am in this light. Serafina raised an eyebrow, a challenge, and an invitation. Then take me where it's dark. I have a place, I said, the decision locking into place like a lens in a housing. But you have to drive. I don't think I can navigate the streets right now. I'm driving, she agreed, pushing off the wall. Show me your stars, Eris. But I'm warning you, I'm still going to look at you. The drive out of the city was a shedding of layers, a gradual decompression that felt physical. We left the sodium vapor glare of the downtown grid behind, the streetlights thinning out until they were replaced by the encroaching dark of the hills. Serafina drove the way she curated, with absolute, fluid intention and zero hesitation. She didn't fill the silence with radio chatter or nervous small talk. She let the low hum of the engine be the only sound, a steady, mechanical bass line to the erratic, fluttering rhythm of my own pulse. We wound up the narrow access road, gravel crunching loudly under the tires, until the dome finally loomed against the stars, a white, silent sentinel standing watch in the dark. Here? She asked, pulling the handbrake with a sharp ratchet sound. Here, I confirmed. I unlocked the heavy steel door of the observatory. It swung open with a groan of protest that echoed in the stillness, the sound of metal on metal that hadn't been oiled in a season. Inside, the air was different. It wasn't just fresh, it was aggressively, bitingly cold. The climate control was set to match the ambient outside temperature to prevent heat plumes from distorting the mirrors. It smelled of heavy machine oil, cold iron, and the specific, dusty scent of time standing still. It was the smell of my sanctuary, usually comforting, but tonight it felt stark. It's freezing, Serafina noted, stepping across the threshold. She didn't shiver this time. She just observed, her breath blooming in a white cloud before her in the gloom. It has to be, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the circular room as I closed the heavy door behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. Thermal equilibrium. If the mirror is warmer than the air, the image wavers. The turbulence ruins the data. We need everything cold to see clearly. I moved to the control panel, my fingers finding the familiar switches by touch alone. I knew this board better than I knew the back of my own hand. "Watch your eyes," I warned. I flipped the master switch. There was no jarring flood of fluorescent light. Instead, the room was bathed in a deep crimson glow. The red safety lights hummed to life, preserving our night vision, but transforming the industrial space into something else entirely. In the red light, the massive steel mount of the telescope looked like the rib cage of some dormant beast, waiting to be woken. The shadows were ink black, the highlights the color of blood and embers. It was a dark room. It was a sanctuary. It was intimate in a way that felt dangerous. "Red light," Seraphina murmured, looking around. The crimson wash softened the sharp angles of her face, making her eyes look like pools of dark oil. "Dramatic." "Functional," I corrected, though I couldn't deny the sudden, heavy atmosphere it created. Rod cells in the human eye are insensitive to long wavelengths. We can see to work, but we don't bleach out our visual purple. We stay adapted to the dark. I moved to the hand paddle, the controller for the dome rotation. This was my instrument. In the gallery, I was a prop. Here, I was the operator. I pressed the button, and the motors engaged with a low, visceral rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. Above us, the slit in the dome began to slide open, the gears grinding a slow, heavy rhythm. A slice of the true sky revealed itself, black, velvet, and studded with diamonds that didn't care about tax brackets or social obligations. I felt Seraphina move. She wasn't looking at the sky. She was leaning against the heavy pier of the telescope, watching me. In the red light, her gaze felt physical, a touch that lingered on my hands as I adjusted the ascension drives. "You're different here," she said softly. The rumble of the dome stopped, leaving a silence that felt louder than the noise had been. "In the gallery, you moved like you were navigating a minefield. Here, you move like water." "I know the variables here," I said, keeping my eyes on the declination setting circles, though the numbers were blurring in my peripheral vision. "The telescope does exactly what I tell it to. It doesn't have expectations. It doesn't ask for small talk. It just reflects what is already there." "And neither do I," she countered. She pushed off the pier, moving into my space with a predator's grace. The red light caught the silver ring on her finger, a flash of fire in the gloom. "I didn't come here for the tour, Eris. I came to see what you look like when you're not afraid of breaking something." I swallowed, my throat dry. My hand hovered over the fine focus knob, trembling slightly. "I'm calibrating," I said, the excuse weak even to my own ears. "I have to align the guide star." "Then align it," she whispered, standing just behind my shoulder now. I could feel the heat of her body radiating against my back, a stark, undeniable contrast to the freezing air of the dome. "But stop pretending you're alone in the room." I wasn't pretending. That was the problem. For the first time in 10 years, the telescope wasn't the most massive object in the room. She was. And her gravity was pulling me away from the eyepiece. I tried to retreat into the procedure, pressing my eye to the cold rubber cup of the eyepiece, desperate to find the familiar comfort of a distant star. But the safety lights, meant to preserve night vision, had a side effect. We couldn't hide. My eyes were wide, black discs, taking in too much detail. "If you look now," I said, my voice sounding ragged, "you can see the Ring Nebula, Messier 57. It's a shell of ionized gas expelled by a red giant star that was passing through the asymptotic giant branch phase." I was rambling. I knew I was rambling. I was throwing up a wall of astrophysics to keep her out, piling technical terms like sandbags against a rising flood. "It's expanding," I continued, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the fine focus knob. "Expanding at a rate of roughly 1 arcsecond per century. It's dying, essentially, shedding its outer layers to reveal the hot, white dwarf core inside." "Shedding its layers," Seraphina repeated. She wasn't looking at the nebula. She was standing right behind me, so close that I could feel the radiant heat of her body through the thin silk of my blouse. The temperature in the dome was hovering near freezing, cold enough to see my breath hitch in the red gloom. But the space between my back and her chest felt like the interior of a kiln. That sounds painful and necessary. I stiffened, my eye still glued to the eyepiece, though the nebula had blurred into a meaningless smudge of gray light. I couldn't focus. The variable I hadn't accounted for, the proximity of another human body, was throwing off the entire calibration. "It's just physics," I whispered, gripping the cold brass of the focus knob. "It's just gravity, losing the war against pressure." "Turn around, Eris." The command was soft, barely louder than the hum of the tracking motor. But it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I didn't move. I couldn't. If I turned around, I would have to acknowledge that the star wasn't the most important thing in the room. I stayed frozen, my hand clutching the focus knob as if it were the only thing anchoring me to the earth. Then, she moved. She didn't grab me. She didn't pull me away. She simply reached out and covered my hand with hers. The sensation was a shock to the system, a sudden, violent recalibration of my entire sensory input. My hand was freezing, the skin numb from the cold brass and the night air. Her hand was hot, alive, and rough. I felt the calluses on her palm, evidence of her work, of crate moving and sculpture hanging, and the smooth, cool metal of the silver ring she wore. She didn't pull my hand away. She just held it there, trapping my freezing fingers between the unyielding machinery of the telescope and the undeniable reality of her touch. The nebula was forgotten. The expansion rates, the ionization levels, the light years, it all dissolved. The entire universe narrowed down to the 3 square inches where her skin touched mine. She murmured against the sensitive skin of my neck, sending a shiver racing down my spine. "Screw the equilibrium." Her thumb moved, a slow, deliberate stroke across the back of my hand, tracing the tendons, mapping the tension. It was a curator's touch, assessing the material, understanding the stress points. "You're not a machine, Eris. You don't have to be cold to see clearly." She applied a gentle pressure, arresting the mechanism, forcing the instrument to a halt. I slowly pulled my face away from the eyepiece. I stared at our hands, mine pale and tense, hers dark and steady, locked together on the controls. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely a breath. "I know how to calculate orbits, but this doesn't follow the laws of motion." Serafina leaned in, her other hand coming up to rest on the heavy steel pier of the telescope, boxing me in. I was trapped between the cold iron of the instrument and the warm, breathing reality of her. She wasn't looking at the stars. She was looking at me with an intensity that made the supernova remnants seem dim. "You're trying to solve it," she said, her eyes searching mine in the crimson gloom. "You're trying to find the equation for why your heart is hammering against your ribs. You're trying to predict the outcome before you've even started the experiment." "I need to know the outcome," I pleaded. "I need to know if it ends in a collision." Serafina's hand tightened over mine on the focus knob, her fingers lacing through my cold ones, claiming the space, claiming the moment. She leaned closer until her forehead was almost touching mine, until our breath mingled in the freezing air, a shared cloud of warmth in the void. "Stop focusing on the light years, Eris," she whispered, the words brushing against my lips. "Focus on the millimeters." The distance didn't close, it collapsed. It was a gravitational capture, inevitable and absolute. I didn't lean in, I was pulled. The last millimeter vanished, and with it, the safety of the void I had lived in for a decade. When her mouth found mine, the impact wasn't violent, but it was heavy. It was the weight of a planet settling into a new orbit. I had expected to analyze it, My brain, wired for constant observation, tried to catalog the variables, the angle, the pressure, the duration, but the data stream fractured instantly. There was no room for analysis. There was only the overwhelming, visceral reality of her. She tasted of the sparkling water from the gallery and the sharp metallic tang of the ozone clinging to her coat. But underneath that, she tasted like heat. It was a shock to my system, a thermal bloom in the freezing dome that made my vision swim. I gasped, a sharp intake of the cold air that mingled with the warmth of her breath. And she took that opening to deepen the connection. The kiss wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. It was the answer to a hypothesis I hadn't dared to test. My hands, still trapped beneath hers on the focus knob, finally broke free. They didn't retreat. They sought purchase. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the collar of her structured jacket, pulling her closer, needing to eliminate even the friction of the air between us. The wool was rough against my palms, a tactile grit that grounded me. But it was the heat radiating through the fabric that undid me. Serafina moved. She didn't step back. She stepped into me. She pressed me back against the heavy steel pier of the telescope. The cold iron bit into my shoulder blades through the thin silk of my blouse, a freezing anchor point that stood in stark, dizzying contrast to the fire of her body pressed against my front. "You're still thinking," she murmured against my lips, her voice a vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard. "Stop thinking, Eris. Just feel." The monitor in my head, the constant scrolling feed of responsibilities, trajectories, and anxieties, flickered. The signal was dying. Her hands left the machinery and found me. They were Curator's hands, strong, capable, used to handling heavy crates and delicate canvases. They weren't tentative. One hand slid up my rib cage, the friction of her palm rough and electrifying against the smooth, expensive silk of my suit. She mapped the tension in my torso with a deliberate, possessive pressure, her thumb digging into the soft space between my ribs, forcing the breath out of me in a shuddering exhale. It was a tactile overload. The freezing air of the dome, the red light bathing us in a surreal photographic gloom, the smell of machine oil and rain, and the demanding, grounding weight of her body pinning me to the earth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking up. I wasn't wondering what was happening 4 light years away. I was entirely, terrifyingly present. My head fell back against the steel mount, exposing the line of my throat to the red darkness. Serafina didn't hesitate. She buried her face in the curve of my neck, her lips hot against the pulse that was hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm beneath my skin. I felt her inhale, a sharp, deep breath, as if she were memorizing the frequency of my panic and soothing it into submission. "I have you," she whispered against my skin. "You're not floating. You're right here." And I was. The realization hit me harder than the cold. I was grounded. The vertigo that had plagued me all evening, the sensation of spinning out into the vacuum, was gone. It was replaced by a density, a heaviness that felt like safety. I wasn't a celestial body drifting in the dark anymore. I was a physical object, held in place by the strongest force in the room. My hands found her hair, pulling the severe style loose until I could feel the silk of it against my frozen fingers. I held on to her like she was the only solid thing in a liquid universe. The kiss she pressed to the hollow of my throat wasn't gentle. It was a mark, a claim. It burned. The silence of the observatory was no longer empty. It was filled with the ragged sound of our breathing, the rustle of fabric, the small, involuntary sounds of resistance crumbling. The intellectual fortress I had built, brick by brick, degree by degree, didn't withstand the siege. It simply dissolved. The data stopped. The equations vanished. There was no past, no future, no distance. There was only the red light, the cold steel, and the undeniable, terrifying heat of the collision. The transition from the red dark to the gray morning usually felt like a violence, a harsh stripping away of the protective layer of the night. But when I opened my eyes, the light filtering through the small, high window of the observatory's attached quarters didn't burn. It was soft, diffused by the mountain mist clinging to the dome, casting a pale, slate-blue wash over the room. I lay still for a long moment, the simple act of waking up feeling foreign. My internal clock, usually calibrated to the second, was silent. I didn't reach for my phone to check the solar weather reports. I didn't mentally catalog the tasks for the day. I just stared at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light, feeling a strange, heavy quiet in my limbs. The frantic vibration Serafina had diagnosed in the gallery, the hum of a machine running at critical capacity, was gone. In its place was a low, steady idle. I sat up, the air in the small room brisk, but not biting. The bed was a narrow, utilitarian cot I kept for marathon observation runs, hardly designed for comfort. Yet I felt more rested than I had in years of sleeping on an orthopedic mattress in a climate-controlled penthouse. The space beside me was empty, the sheets cool, but the door to the kitchenette was ajar, and the smell of coffee, cheap, instant, and utterly unpretentious, drifted through. I stood up, finding my silk blouse draped over a chair. It looked ridiculous here, a ghost of the gala hanging in a room meant for science. I ignored it, pulling on an oversized wool sweater I kept in the closet for winter shifts. It was moth-eaten at the cuffs and smelled of old books, but it covered me. I walked into the kitchenette. It was a glorified closet with a hot plate and a sink, but Serafina made it look like a studio. She was leaning against the narrow counter, holding a chipped mug, looking at a large format star chart I had tacked to the wall months ago. It was a plot of the Perseus arm, a dense, chaotic scatter of data points that I used for reference. She didn't turn when I entered. She just took a sip of the coffee, her eyes tracing the lines of declination. She was still wearing the white shirt from the night before, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hair loose and dark against the pale fabric. "There's no order to it," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. It wasn't a critique. It sounded like wonder. I moved to the counter, pouring hot water over the granules in my own mug. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, a small domestic sound that felt monumental in the quiet. "It's a map," I said, watching her profile. "It's a coordinate system. Everything there has a position and a velocity." "No," she corrected, finally turning to look at me. Her eyes were clear, catching the morning light. "It's a composition. You see a grid. I see a splash of ink on a dark canvas. It's messy, Eris. That's why it works." She handed me my mug. Our fingers brushed, a brief, warm contact that didn't send a jolt of panic through me this time, but rather a hum of recognition. "I made it strong," she said. "I figured you'd need the caffeine to restart the computer brain." I took a sip. It was bitter, metallic, and perfect. "The computer is offline," I admitted, leaning back against the counter, the ceramic warming my hands. I looked past her, through the open door to the main dome. The telescope was parked, the slit closed against the day. The monitors were dark. For the first time in a decade, I had let the sky turn without watching it. I hadn't logged the temperature variances. I hadn't adjusted for the atmospheric refraction. I had simply let the universe exist without my supervision, and the terrifying realization washed over me. Nothing had collapsed. The stars were still there, burning in the daylight where I couldn't see them. The galaxies continued their slow, grand rotation. The physics of the cosmos remained intact, indifferent to whether or not Dr. Eris Thorne was taking notes. "I slept," I whispered. the confession feeling more vulnerable than anything I had said the night before. I actually slept. Serafina smiled, and it wasn't the predatory smile from the street, nor the challenging smirk from the gallery. It was soft, satisfied. She reached out, her hand settling on my forearm over the rough wool of the sweater. I know. You stopped vibrating. I missed the morning calibration, I said, looking at the dark monitors. The stars aren't going anywhere, Eris, she said, stepping closer until she was in my personal space again, grounding me in the morning light. They've been there for billions of years. They can wait for you to have a cup of coffee. I looked at the chart on the wall, then at the woman standing in my kitchen. The parallax had shifted again. The infinite distance of the sky felt less important than the 2 feet of space between us. I suppose they can, I said. And for the first time, I believed it. Returning to the Department of Astrophysics usually felt like re-entering a sterile containment unit. The white walls, the hum of the server banks, the smell of dry erase markers. It was a habitat designed for intellect, not life. But walking in on Monday morning, the air felt different. Or maybe I was different. I sat at my desk, the mahogany surface usually cleared for maximum efficiency, now holding a small, rough meteorite paperweight that hadn't been there before. It was a dark blemish on the perfect finish, and I loved it. I opened the data stream from the weekend's observation run. The numbers cascaded down the screen. Spectral analysis of a distant quasar. Before, this was the only language that made sense to me. It was clean. It was distant. But as I scrolled through the redshift values, my mind drifted. I wasn't thinking about the expansion of the universe. I was thinking about the expansion of my own lungs when Serafina laughed. I was thinking about the friction of her wool coat against my arm and the taste of instant coffee. My phone buzzed against the desk. A week ago, that sound would have triggered a cortisol spike, a grant deadline, a telescope malfunction, a donor emergency. I picked it up. The screen didn't show a system alert. It showed a message from Serafina. Just 3 words. Look down, stargazer. I walked to the window. My office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the campus quad. Down below, amidst the stream of students and faculty navigating the concrete paths, she was there. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was standing near the fountain, wearing that same structural coat, looking up. She saw me. She didn't wave. That would be too common. She just held my gaze across the vertical distance, a silent tether connecting the ground to the sky. I realized then that the void I had carried around for years, that cold, hollow space in my chest that I tried to fill with galaxies, was gone. It had been filled by the memory of red light and rough hands. The isolation wasn't a prerequisite for the work anymore. In fact, the isolation had been a critical, variable error. I went to my lecture that afternoon. The hall was packed. 200 students waiting for me to explain the life cycle of stars. Usually, I delivered the material from behind the podium, a disembodied voice in the dark. Today, I stepped out. I walked the stage. I looked them in the eye. Gravity, I said, my voice projecting without the microphone, is often described as a force of attraction. But it's more than that. It's a curvature. It's the way massive objects bend the space around them, creating a path for others to follow. I paused, thinking of the way the air bent around Serafina, the way my entire trajectory had curved to meet hers. We think of orbits as lonely paths through the dark, but an orbit is actually a relationship. It's a constant, dynamic fall towards something that catches you. I finished the lecture not with a slide of a dead star, but with an image of a binary system. 2 stars dancing around a common center of gravity, neither consuming the other, just balancing. Stable. Bright. Beautiful. Later, packing up my bag, The phantom limb sensation returned. I could feel the ghost of her hand on my waist, a warm pressure that made the walk to the parking lot feel less like a march and more like a return. I wasn't going home to a silent penthouse to stare at the ceiling. I was going to a cluttered apartment that smelled of sage, old paper, and life. I was going to argue about art. I was going to drink wine that wasn't champagne. This wasn't a passing comet. Comets are icy, temporary visitors that flare up and fade away. This was a new cosmological constant, a fixed value in the equation of my life. I checked my phone one last time. Dinner at 8. Bring the meteorite. I smiled, a genuine expression that felt loose and easy on my face. The universe was still infinite, yes. It was still expanding, still cooling, still full of mysteries I would spend my career trying to solve. But the scale of it didn't terrify me anymore. I didn't need the distance to feel safe. I could look at the infinite, knowing that when I closed my eyes, there was something intimate waiting to pull me back down. The telescope can show you the birth of a galaxy, but it can't show you how to be warm. I spent a lifetime mapping the edges of the universe, only to find the most important coordinate was right here, on the ground. I left the observatory key on the table. I wouldn't need to hide there anymore. If you've ever found your gravity in someone else's eyes, subscribe now to follow the rest of the journey.